So, good morning, everyone. Bonjour à tout le monde. Let me seize the opportunity to welcome those coming from across the continent to the beautiful city of Rabat. We at the Pan-African Youth Union are excited to meet our colleagues from across the continent, and it's always a pleasure to have an opportunity to engage with young people and change makers across Africa. I probably would take just a couple of minutes before I go to the slides to give you a brief about the Pan-African Youth Union and what we do. So the Pan-African Youth Union was founded in 1962 by a decision of African heads of states in Guinea-Conakry. And the basis for its foundation was to mobilize the youth threshold to support the decolonization of Africa. So many years down the line, most African countries, if not all, became independent. So it was important to redirect the energies of young people, understand and know that Africa is the most youthful continent in the world. And it's also important for us to recognize that when Europe was the most youthful continent in the world, they used those youthful energies to drive economic development and prosperity. When it was time for the Americas, they did the same. The South Americans, we are not sure if we can do a proper evaluation of what they are doing, but it's Africa's turn. And we say it's time for Africa to harness our demographic dividends. Harnessing these demographic dividends means that young people must be actively involved in not just policy formulation and implementation, but in contributing meaningfully to the economic prosperity and development of Africa. By doing so, it means working very hard, being innovative to improve quality of life and welfare. It means repositioning the continent and placing us in context of global influence. And that is our core responsibility. Now, when the organization was founded, from 2002, there was the need to review and reform the institution from being an activist-oriented organization to be a development-oriented one. And so the government of Namibia at the time had led the process of remobilizing young people across the continent. And in 2003, there was the first Congress when it was changed from the Pan-African Youth Movement to the Pan-African Youth Union. And from 2003, the Pan-African Youth Union mobilized young people and youth leaders across the continent to birth the African Youth Charter that was adopted in 2006 by African Union heads of states through Executive Council Decision 292 of 2006. Whilst the Youth Charter was adopted as the continental blueprint for youth development, it meant that every member state of the African Union should sign, ratify, and domesticate that policy. And I believe that for those of you that are active in the space, you know that the African Youth Charter became the continental blueprint on which most of our national youth policies were crafted and are currently being operationalized. And so if you take each of our national youth policies, they become a domesticated version of this continental blueprint. And why was African Youth Charter very important? It was important because Africa needed to harmonize youth development across board, because every country, irrespective of your spatial location, had an intrinsic interconnectivity. So what happens in Morocco affects Mauritania, and affects Senegal, and Mali, and Niger, and subsequently to Ghana, or Nigeria, or Chad, or to South Africa. And therefore, you cannot conduct or implement youth development policy being oblivious of the implications on your neighbors. And whilst you neighbor country A neighbors country C, and country C neighbors country F. And therefore, it was important for the continent to harmonize youth inclusion and mainstreaming. Now, years down the line, and the same decision 292 of 2006 also recognized the revitalization of the Pan-African Youth Union from the Pan-African Youth Movement and established it as the continental coordinating body for youth and youth organizations. The African Youth Charter in Article 12 mandated states or obliged states to set up national youth coordinating mechanisms, which currently we know as national youth councils. Those national youth councils had a responsibility of mobilizing and coordinating youth work across member states. And so the Pan-African Youth Union federates all these national coordinating mechanisms across the continent. And it's important to tell the House that just a fortnight ago, the Pan-African Youth Union, with support from the Kingdom of Morocco, convened a ministerial meeting. And that ministerial meeting, we had 50 national youth coordinating mechanisms gathering here in Rabat to have a conversation around the implementation of the African Youth Charter. Now, from 2009, when the Conference of Youth Ministers met in Congo-Brazzaville and made decisions on how to drive youth development, the Ministers of Youth urged African member states to provide a befitting secretariat for the Pan-African Youth Union. And so the government of Sudan at the time offered to host the headquarters of the Pan-African Youth Union until 2021, when, based on the political instability and the other social effects on the organization, it was important for another member state of the African Union to offer shelter to the Pan-African Youth Union. The government of Morocco graciously offered to host our continental organization. And so in February 2021, the headquarters of the Pan-African Youth Union was moved from the Republic of Sudan to the Kingdom of Morocco. And I can tell you that since the movement of the headquarters from Khartoum to Sudan, the government of Morocco have been gracious, they have been supportive, they have walked the journey with the young people of this continent, and I'm confident that the actions that we jointly undertake are strategic to propel the youth development ecosystem on the continent to one that is capable of translating all the numerous policy frameworks that we have on the continent to action, and also mobilizing young people across board, irrespective of geography, to contribute meaningfully to the socio-economic development of the continent. Now, having said this, I would want to touch briefly on what the continental or Africa's commitment to youth is. I think that before 2006, I've always said that there's been some knee-jerk reaction to youth development. Knee-jerk because it would take young people to begin to agitate for government to say, look, you know what, let us address the concerns of young people. And when young people tend to go a little sober, then everybody goes to sleep. But from 2004, when the Ouagadougou Declaration was adopted, and the Ouagadougou Declaration looked at youth employment, poverty eradication, and empowerment of young people, that became the foundation for the formulation and adoption of the African Youth Charter. Why? Because Africa as a continent was ravaged by war, unemployment, massive deprivation, were young people, women, and children. So it was important to have a conversation around how government would adopt a concerted approach to addressing that. These approaches to advocacy. The Youth Charter reinforced our right-based approach because once a country signed and ratified that, it became domestic law and gave young people an opportunity to use that document in a justiciable way. Now, from 2006, we had 2009 to 2018, where the African Youth Decade Plan of Action was adopted. Most countries, and I dare say that most countries saw that document as a very fanciful one, and in evaluating 2009 to 2018, really, we continental frameworks. Now, the 2011 documents, where the Pan-African Youth Union actually facilitated, led the conversation around what young people really felt should be our place in the entire continental development space. We had a commitment made by government, including setting up of the African Youth Fund, of which, as I speak to you now, there's no fund. 2011 also gave an opportunity for Africa to come out with the slogan of Year of Youth and harnessing our demographic dividends. But again, as young people, we need to understand that is here to walk the journey with you, because you are the Pan-African Youth Union, you are Africa, and we are simply conduits for amplifying and scaling up your aspirations. Thank you.